This video is sponsored by CuriosityStream and Nebula, a creator-owned streaming service where you can watch my videos completely ad-free, but more on this at the end.
We have to stand up to evil.
All of us have the potential to become heroes, to follow our conscience and stand against evil. At least, that is what many of our stories tell us, in particular those that feature characters with a strong sense of morality. Characters who are principled, who are unwavering in their devotion to justice.
You just don't know when to give up, do you?
I can do this all day.
When evil presents itself to them, they are pushed into a decisive moment. Do they falter, or do they stand? Either way, the choice is tangible, urgent. It often presents itself as a clear chance for these characters to define themselves as moral individuals, to demonstrate their belief in righteousness, to become a force for good, even if it comes at a personal price.
I don't know how I'm gonna live with myself if I don't stay true to what I believe.
We walk away from these stories uplifted, not only because, in the case of true stories, we are grateful for those who sacrifice themselves for the betterment of others, but also because we are comforted by the belief that evil is something that we can overcome, that we can distance ourselves from. This is why we value heroes so much, and call them heroes in the first place. They give us the assurance that if our own moral integrity is called upon, we now know how to act, how to do what is right. They provide us with a moral compass, with guidance for meaningful action. They remind us that we always have a choice, that we always carry within us the potential for good, and inspire us to take on the responsibility to bring it about.
Remember that howsoever you are plagued, or by whom, your soul is in your keeping alone. Even though those who presume to plague you be kings or men of power, when you stand before God, you cannot say, "But I was told by others to do thus," or that virtue was not convenient at the time. This will not suffice. Remember that.
I love these kinds of stories. I think they're important to help shape us as moral individuals and progress our society for the better. But then, there's also that other feeling.
Americans throw away $165
You're covered with
billion
blood,
worth of
feces,
food.
urine. It's easy to get hurt down there.
We've been told there were some children here making clothes for the gap.
A UN
This
panel says
is
the region
Tina.
resembles a massive
She's
internment camp, where more than 1 million Muslim minorities...
Basically treated as a human machine.
I'm sure you've experienced it too. These moments where you look upon our modern world and the sheer absurdity of it just hits you. Like a hidden voice in the back of your conscience that flares up, as Elliot's does in Mr. Robot, in a fierce yet quickly fleeting outrage to tell you that all this talk about heroism and morality is nothing but a distraction, a veil to hide the dark reality underneath.
Is it that we collectively thought Steve Jobs was a great man, even when we knew he made billions off the backs of children? Or maybe it's that it feels like all our heroes are counterfeit. The world itself's just one big hoax.
I think it is fair to assume that we all walk around with this vague, mostly docile awareness of the evils that surround us, and more specifically, of the evils that we ourselves participate in, or that we are in some way or another connected to. We buy products, consume media, enjoy events, with much of it, especially nowadays, seeming to be intrinsically linked to the exploitation of workers, mistreatment of animals, pollution of the environment, the creation of disproportionate waste, crimes against humanity, and the general degradation of the moral fiber of our society and of ourselves.
We all have blood on our hands. No one is innocent. Crime, bloodshed everywhere.
This isn't meant as some grand revelation. We all know this.
I'm not saying anything new.
In fact, you're probably tired of hearing it. Tired of all the news reports, exposés and documentaries relentlessly torturing your conscience. Tired of feeling like you can no longer do anything without committing some kind of moral transgression. The film network already observed this frustration decades ago, and I can imagine the wariness must only have built over time.
We know The air is unfit to breathe, and our food is unfit to eat. We know things are bad, worse than bad. They're crazy.
And yet, this to me only makes it more important to talk about. Not just because it is always valid to ask what it means to be an ethical individual in the larger context of a society, but also because it feels like many of our stories seem to struggle with navigating morality in our modern world, and are more likely to offer escapes from the pressing issues of our time, rather than insights and meaningful moral guidance.
We sit in the house, and slowly the world we're living in is getting smaller, and all we say is, please, at least leave us alone in our living rooms.
We all know why we do this, not because Hunger Games books makes us happy, but because we want to be sedated, because it's painful not to pretend, because we're cowards.
Just leave us alone. Well, I'm not going to leave you alone.
Unlike Elliot and Mr. Beale here, I do find this reaction understandable, sympathetic even. To some extent, I think it is natural to shield ourselves in some way from the full moral weight of all of our daily choices and interactions. That we don't want to spend all of our time consuming stories that only remind us of all the evils that surround us. For how could we possibly function otherwise, especially considering that many of these issues are too big, too widespread, and too complex for us to resolve on our own.
Is it just me? Or is it getting crazier out there?
But this is also my great worry, that the desensitization goes too far, that the walls go up too high. I dread to think about what has to happen for us to be truly outraged again. And I mean that not in the sense of a visceral yet ultimately ineffectual outpouring of frustration and cynicism, and the empty displays of revolt that so often go with it, but in the sense of stories becoming true driving forces for action. Can we still imagine such tales of heroism? What would they even look like? For how can we claim morality as individuals when evil is not some kind of external entity that we can fight off in grand heroic moments, but is woven into the very fabric of our daily being? What if the world as a stage for heroism is in itself, as Eliot put it earlier, a hoax? If our world is full of evil, what does it mean then to be good?
Elliot, you're not saying anything. What's wrong?
Nothing.
The concept of moral ambiguity and the notion that our actions have far-reaching ethical consequences that we cannot entirely separate ourselves from is obviously not an exclusively modern phenomenon. It has been a fundamental part of discussions of ethics throughout philosophical history, though I would argue that there are some specifically modern elements that have made it more complicated.
We no longer live in a world of nations and ideologies, Mr. Beale. The world is a business.
For starters, there's the development of globalization, the growing interconnectedness of the world, which is beautifully visualized by the 2011 film Samsara, which takes an abstract approach to show how more and more aspects of our everyday consumption and being have been disconnected from their local roots, fragmented, and recontextualized into much larger processes. Another great film that documents the globalization of our society is Home. This 2009 film offers a bird's-eye view of our progression from agricultural communities to a society that stretches over the entire globe. It shows how, thanks to advancements in energy, communication, and transportation, it has become easier than ever for people, products, and ideas to spread across the world. To give you some examples, we travel more often and further. We can connect with pretty much anyone over the internet. And whereas our diet used to be made up of mostly local foods and was largely subservient to seasonal patterns, we are now eating products from all over the world that are supplied to us in a mostly steady and unchanging supply.
A city of uniformly sized vegetables waits every day for the hundreds of trucks that will take them to the continent's supermarkets.
While there are certainly good things to say about this development and about how it has progressed our society in a lot of areas, it has also proven to be a complicating factor when it comes to our pursuit for morality. On a more theoretical level, The foundations of these documentaries are supported by the work of sociologist Alan Snyberg, who, in 1980, presented his treadmill of production theory to address the issue of how the global markets, especially since the last century, have been increasingly linked to a significant deterioration of the environment, social justice, and other ethical standards we generally value.
A country of farmers became a country of agricultural industrialists. Machines replaced men.
Snyberg noticed how, after the Second World War, Western economies became defined by what seems to be an insatiable quest for profit, and began to increasingly accumulate capital by carelessly extracting resources, dumping toxic waste back into the environment, and either replacing workers with new technologies, or moving production to places where labor forces were cheaper and less protected. The profits generated from all this were then used to create even more efficiency, to progress, as Home frequently emphasizes,
faster and faster,
thereby creating a vicious cycle, or as Snyberg depicted it, a treadmill that is continuously spinning but not actually moving forward. In fact, it seems it is slowly taking us to the capitalist dystopias we see in so many stories today. Dystopias that are defined by high technologies on the one hand, but also by ruined environments and the deterioration of human rights on the other. Normally, our governments should, to some extent, protect us from this. They should function as safeguarding institutions that set norms and laws that we all have to abide by, and they should interfere when those norms and laws are broken by villainous corporations. Like we for example see in Quantum of Solace, in which 007 faces an enemy who is essentially just a capitalist.
This is the world's most precious resource. We need to control as much of it as we can.
Unfortunately, as Snyberg also observed, many governments facilitated or even actively promoted the treadmill of production because of the dominant neoliberal ideology in the latter half of the 20th century, which believed that economic growth was the best path for social progress, and that any negative side effects would eventually be ironed out by more modernization.
You don't need another Marxist giving national resources to the people, do you?
Many stories tend to represent this passiveness of governments as them being actively corrupted. And while this can certainly be the case sometimes, Snyberg presents a more nuanced picture in which, after the more serious concerns about the limits to growth eventually came to light, the treadmill had already become so entrenched, so vast and so widespread that it largely exceeded the power of any one government to do anything about it without risking either international conflicts or significant disruptions to their economy and society. The result of all this, as the German sociologist Ulrich Beck articulated it, is a state of organized irresponsibility, a state in which our system has become so large and complex that no one is willing or able to take responsibility for the evils it produces.
The world is a dangerous place, Elliot, not because of those who do evil, but because of those who look on and do nothing.
From our perspective as consumers, and as individuals striving for morality, what this left us with is, for one, a much larger area in our lives within which our ethical beliefs could potentially be compromised as a direct or indirect result of our own actions. And perhaps more importantly, it resulted in an increasing lack of oversight into where and how our ethical beliefs are compromised if they are. You could say, however, that this problem is to some extent mitigated by the dawn of the information age, our increased access to what goes on in the world, and therefore our potential awareness about unethical practices that we disagree with and want to distance ourselves from. Many of the arguments for free markets and neoliberalism certainly seem to rely on this, and posit that if, let's say, we learn of a company doing something we deem unethical, we could just not buy their product and use our wallets to promote morality and bring about a better world. In fact, there's a growing movement that is built upon this idea that we can change things for the better by changing our individual lifestyles. Beck observed this too and referred to it as subpolitics, the increasing focus on one's personal lifestyle as a tool for political action. Especially in recent years, companies are playing into this by specifically branding their products as sustainable, fair trade, animal friendly, or some other label that suggests an ethical standard that serves to ease our conscience, and perhaps even makes us feel more ethical by consuming these products. The reality of all this, however, is much more complicated. Not only because, as we all know, our age of information is also very much one of misinformation, which is thoroughly explored by a great video essay from Evia, link in the description below, but also because it rests on certain assumptions that are easily overlooked. Assumptions about who is given the burden of morality, and inversely, about who is absolved from evil.
If God gives us free will, we're responsible for what we do, what we fail to do, aren't we?
For a number of years, I too felt strongly drawn to subpolitical action. I've been very conscious about my diet and have been trying to cut down on needless consumption, airplane travel, and wasteful output, in an effort to better align my actions with my beliefs and to reclaim some sense of morality, to make a heroic stand as seen in so many stories.
It is a kingdom of conscience, or nothing.
This makes perfect sense given that this is the foundation of many philosophies of personal ethics, which are generally centered around our own actions, our own freedom to choose, our own capacity to distinguish between good and evil.
Goodness comes from within. Goodness is chosen. When a man cannot choose, he ceases to be a man.
And while I still strongly believe that this is true, that we carry a responsibility as individuals to reflect on how we impact the world, and should make an effort to correct ourselves when we cause harm, I've also come to believe that this otherwise well-intended and valid aspiration towards goodness is in some sense corrupted. It is being abused, not by ourselves, but by the structures that have emerged around us.
The Antichrist is clever. He uses a man's virtues to mislead him.
It's kind of strange how we've pretty much come to accept, albeit reluctantly, that large corporations and global markets act based on potential profit first and moral consideration second. That governments no longer have the power or intention to safeguard many of the rights and values we hold dear, and that it is up to us to correct both of them when things inevitably go wrong. For what is essentially suggested here is that we as individuals have to carry the burden of morality completely by ourselves. Let's say we are willing to make this heroic sacrifice. Let's say we want to be a warrior of subpolitical action. What does it really mean to distance ourselves from all the evils around us, to become a martyr in the context of our modern society?
Some fights, you can't win. The powerful control the lives of the powerless. That's the way the world works.
No longer to be poisoned by civilization, he flees, and walks alone upon the land to become lost in the wild.
With so much of our daily interactions being outside of our area of control and susceptible to unethical consequences, the only way to reclaim true morality is to reject our world in its entirety, to follow the characters in stories like Into the Wild and Captain Fantastic, and retreat into isolation. Or so it seems.
This is a mistake. It's a mistake to get too deep into all that kind of stuff.
Although I understand the spirit behind this course of action, to me it also illustrates the exact problem of having the burden of morality placed solely on the individual. Our very being becomes demonized, our existence fundamentally sinful. This, for one, muddles what I think is an important distinction between the natural impact we inevitably have as living beings on this planet, and the impact that we specifically deem as unethical, and therefore, the impact that we want to take action against. But more importantly, it creates a world of tremendous fear, a world that demands us to punish ourselves, to make sacrifices beyond what is reasonable, lest we become hypocrites, frauds. A world that demands us to take extreme action, or lets us have no claim to morality at all.
No! No! Damn it!
In psychology, there's a theory called fear appeal, which explores how fear can be an effective tool to motivate people into action. In an article from the International Journal of Economic and Business Research, Kayleen C. Williams presents an overview of the existing literature on fear appeal theory, and found that for a fear appeal to be effective, one must, among other things, take into account that an individual's response to a threat is based on two cognitive processes: threat appraisal and coping appraisal.
If the rebels have obtained a complete technical readout of this station, it is possible, however unlikely, that they might find a weakness and exploit it.
Using stories as examples, to get ourselves to act, we not only need to be able to perceive a threat, but we also need to be able to see a way to resolve it. In other words, we need hope, no matter how small. Fear appeals will not be successful, Williams continues, if the individual feels powerless to change the behavior. In the real world, what this means is that if we are told to stop using so much plastic, to stop wearing unsustainable clothing, stop eating so many animal products, drive less, fly less, use less energy, we need to be able to actually see a viable alternative path. And for that, we need governments and markets working with us to safeguard and progress sustainable and moral lifestyles. Otherwise, there is a good chance such fear appeals will backfire. In another meta-analysis of fear appeal theory, Kim Witte and Mike Allen emphasize that fear appeals can become dysfunctional when the individual is presented with a threat, but can find no real way to meaningfully resolve it. It is a frustration that is likely experienced by those who, deep down, feel burdened with a moral responsibility they know they cannot live up to. And as a consequence of not being able to find a path for meaningful action, we instead find coping mechanisms. We look away, we deny, we become defensive, we blame others, we focus only on minor evils that we can control. Whatever it is, do not address the real threat, the real evil that confronts us, and that we should engage with. In short, what fear appeal teaches us is that when the burden of morality becomes too great, we are likely to just avoid it altogether. Similarly to the markets and governments, we become passive, paralyzed. We become unable or unwilling to act in a meaningful, constructive way. And so when, as a result of all this, our pursuit for true morality becomes stagnated, when we lose the will to act, when we shrink away from our responsibility, evil becomes a banality. When I was writing my essay on anti-war cinema, I came across a quote from Hannah Arendt, who wrote, "Good can be radical, evil can never be radical. It can only be extreme, for it possesses neither depth nor any demonic dimension. Yet, and this is its horror, it can spread like a fungus over the surface of the earth and lay waste the entire world. Evil comes from a failure to think. It defies thought, for as soon as thought tries to engage itself with evil and examine the premises and principles from which it originates, it is frustrated because it finds nothing there. That is the banality of evil." Arendt wrote this in the context of the trial of Adolf Eichmann, a Nazi officer involved in the organization of the Holocaust. For Arendt, Eichmann's ordinary demeanor stood in remarkable contrast with the crime he had committed. The kind of crime for which one would expect the perpetrator to be sadistic, perverted, or evil in some other obvious way, and not, as it appeared to be, a terrifyingly normal individual, someone who was just following orders. This, to her, was the banality of evil, the thoughtlessness with which severe crimes can be committed.
Whenever I have a difficult decision to make, I come here. This place brings a clarity to any decision.
I bring this up because even after so many years, we still seem reluctant to confront the true meaning of Arendt's words. In the show Sense8, there is a scene filmed at the Holocaust Memorial in Berlin, which shows the quote,
"Is the Holocaust an aberration or a reflection of who we really are?"
Although the inscription was designed for the show and isn't actually there, I think the words are thought-provoking nonetheless, for they urge us to question if the Holocaust really is just a misstep in history, one that we, to some extent, can distance ourselves from in the present, or if it was an expression of something that we still carry with us today, and therefore that all of us could have been complicit in. Now, I am a fan of Steven Spielberg's Schindler's List. I thought it was a harrowing but beautiful story about the intrinsic value of human life and about the difference that an individual can make. But as screenwriter David Mamet once pointed out, the film is also, as strange as it may sound, kind of comforting. This was not to say that the film was not unsettling, horrifying even, nor was it meant to imply that the film mitigates the severity of the crime that had been committed. No, what it means is that Schindler's List was the kind of film that, in the end, makes you feel that you are on the right side of history. It lets you walk away with the assurance that you would have never taken part in an evil like this, and that you would never allow to let it happen today. This lesson is a lie, Mamet wrote. The audience is not superior to those bad Nazis. Any of us has the capacity for atrocity, just as each of us has the capacity for heroism. But the film panders to the audience. It invites them, as does any melodrama, to reward themselves for seeing that the villain is bad, and, in the liberal fallacy, of feeling this perception is a moral accomplishment. Again, I do want to emphasize that this does not mean that a film like Schindler's List is bad or devoid of any meaningful moral lessons. But I do think this kind of criticism helps us to be more conscious about what lessons exactly we're taking away from it. There is a fantastic video essay by Lee Singer that explores how cinema has been struggling to capture the Holocaust in a meaningful way, and how some have argued that perhaps we should not attempt to do so at all. Among others, Singer quotes the famous line from Theodor Adorno, "To write poetry after Auschwitz is barbaric," and includes Claude Lanzmann, director of the renowned 9-hour-long documentary Shoah, who strongly believed that there are some things that cannot and should not be represented in fiction, and who therefore employed a highly minimalistic approach including only present-day shots, eyewitness accounts, and straightforward editing.
Niemand kann das nicht bringen zum Besinnen, es war so, was da hier war.
Not all filmmakers, however, agree with this notion that some events are exempt from examination through fiction, such as Tim Blake Nelson, who directed a Holocaust film called The Grey Zone.
As extraordinary as some of the filmmakers are who have made this argument, it's a silly argument. It's also a self-righteous one, because I wonder what these people think about the film The Killing Fields, or about Platoon. It's saying the Holocaust is more sacred.
And for the purpose of our discussion here, I think this is an important point to consider, because putting the cinematic depictions of the Holocaust aside, what I believe this also illustrates is the risk of mythologizing evil, of using stories to give evil a face, an aesthetic, and a set of characteristics that are too specific, too definitive, and, most importantly, too externalized, too easy to distance ourselves from. The totalitarian governments, the evil corporate tyrants, the false messiahs. There are so many stories filled with images of obvious evils like these, that it makes sense that we have difficulty comprehending evil as a banality, as something that we too are inherently connected to, and that we, especially today, cannot heroically conquer by eliminating a singular external obstacle.
You don't get it. There is no head to cut off. It's a conglomerate.
And this, I think, is what Hannah Arendt tried to point out. We need to articulate a better understanding of human evil, One that is not necessarily defined by malicious intent and carried out by villainous individuals, but one that, in a way, makes all of us complicit, not because we are inherently sinful, but because we are part of greater systems that, as a whole, can produce outcomes that could be considered as evil. These systems transform over time, and the evils they produce are never produced in quite the same way. We must, therefore, maintain a constant awareness. We have to remain vigilant, and this implies, as controversial as this still is to so many people, that we must make evil more directly relatable, empathetic. We have to start seeing it as a force that is a structural part of our being, that is created and upheld by an interconnection of countless highly complicated processes that we cannot possibly hope to fully separate ourselves from, and that we are engaged in, as Arendt wrote, without any depth or demonic dimension. So how do we battle this kind of evil? How can we transform not just ourselves but our entire system for the better? How can we reclaim morality as a society? It seems like an impossible task, and it is understandable that stories struggle to successfully engage with it. But let's see what we can learn from them nonetheless.
A revolution is coming. Join us.
There is no shortage of films that explore the concept of revolution, of overturning the status quo through an often civilian resistance, and reclaiming a lost sense of morality. But, as mentioned before, these often tend to feature an obvious enemy, an obvious evil to overcome, most often a totalitarian government or some other oppressive force. And while these stories do seem to better fit the power dynamics as found in traditional storytelling structures in which a hero, or a group of heroes, heroically overcome a clearly defined evil to restore justice to their world, they do not immediately seem to reflect the socio-political landscape and moral complexities of our modern society.
You're becoming a bit of a legend. I hear more and more people talk about the freedom fighters who are pushing back.
When looking at some characters that do specifically want to change the ills of our modern society, it is interesting that they are more likely to be the villain of the story. Marvel's recent show The Falcon and the Winter Soldier, for example, introduced us to Carly Morgenthau and her group The Flag Smashers, who pursue a world without borders and without nations. A world in which we all exist and help each other as one people.
One world.
One people.
One world.
One people.
One world.
One people.
As such, she follows other Marvel villains like Killmonger, who wanted to restore the injustices that still linger from a colonial past, and Zemo, who wanted to protect us from a world in which all the power is given to a select few who are free to act outside of the law. All these are causes that, in and of themselves, could be considered as noble and worthy of pursuing. But what always seems to happen, however, is that at one point, there is a clear moment where these characters cross the line.
There were still people in there.
This is the only language these people understand.
They kill innocent people or commit some other unambiguous moral transgression that cuts off our sympathy for them, and gives them the definitive label as villains.
You're killing innocent people.
They're not innocent. They're roadblocks in my journey, and I'd kill them again if I had to.
Wow.
As an unfortunate consequence, this also tends to be where the discussion about their initial beliefs comes to an abrupt end. We get a sympathetic nod from the hero, and are left with the implied suggestion that it is better not to take radical action within our society, that trying to significantly upend the status quo will surely lead to corruption and violence.
I agree with your fight. I just can't get with the way you're fighting it.
We also saw this sentiment in Game of Thrones, where we spent years following Daenerys and her quest to liberate the oppressed and the helpless. At one point, she likened the power dynamics of Westeros to a wheel.
Lannister, Targaryen, Baratheon, Stark, Tyrell, they're all just spokes on a wheel.
This one's on top, then that one's on top, and on it spins, crushing those on the ground.
And made a declaration for radical action.
I'm not going to stop the wheel. I'm going to break the wheel.
But in the end, she too crossed the line. The Liberator became a tyrant and had to be stopped, leaving us again with the suggestion that wanting a better world too much is not a good thing, that this will inevitably lead to violence. And although I agree that it is important to be wary of grandiose individuals, of those who, as I discuss in more detail in my video on our pursuit for meaningful justice, have become so radicalized that they no longer tolerate any compromise, and that what they are really in search of is absolute power.
The desire to become a superhuman cannot be separated from supremacist ideals.
Anyone who seeks to attain the power of a god must be prevented at all costs from attaining it.
I do wonder, however, if this reluctance to truly explore radical action in the context of our modern society stems from the genuine belief that it is bound to do more harm than good, or that these storytellers simply cannot imagine, or don't want to imagine, what kind of world could be achieved through it. I think that part of the reluctance can be explained by considering how strong actions tend to be connected to strong emotions. And many people fear strong emotions. It is true that we are talking about issues here that are rooted in deep feelings. If I really look at what lies at the root of my own emotions about all this, how I truly feel is not passively cynical or pessimistic in some vague, detached way. No, I feel angry. Angry at the world we live in, at all the evils it is continuously producing, and at the way we all just seem to allow it to go on day after day. I feel angry at the banality with which we exploit workers, mistreat animals, pollute the environment, create disproportionate waste, commit crimes against humanity, and degrade the moral fiber of our society and of ourselves. And sometimes, as I'm sure many others do, I too entertain the fantasy of just tearing it all down, of reclaiming morality by force. But of course, this is not me being rational. This is not me being reasonable. I know the world is, in many ways, much more pleasant than it ever has been. I know all these issues are complicated, that there are many well-intended people working hard to make things better, that we cannot just bring our society to a screeching halt in demand of moral perfection. And yet, I do believe that these feelings matter, and that we need to nurture our relation to the conscience that awakens them. For the opposite to emotionality is not reason or rationality, it is deadness, carelessness, and indeed, evil. And so, even at the risk of becoming reckless, it is important to keep that fire burning.
All I know is that first, you've got to get mad. You've got to say, I'm a human being, God damn it! My life has value!
The real challenge, as it seems to be, is directing all that energy purposefully. As with the fear appeals that were discussed earlier, we need to be able to perceive a meaningful course of action. We need to feel that we can make some kind of difference. And for that, we first need better stories. Stories that help change our understanding of the way evil takes root within our world, takes root within ourselves. Reclaiming our morality begins with acknowledging that evil is something that we are complicit in, but also that it is something that we are not solely responsible for. And so, even though individual responsibility is still important, perhaps it is time that we stop carrying the burden of morality by ourselves, that we truly start holding accountable those in positions of power and influence, those who have been avoiding their responsibility, or who have only been making symbolic gestures, and that we start demanding true heroism again, the kind of heroism that takes hard work and sacrifice, the kind that is not convenient, but necessary.
You've got to do better, Senator. You've got to step up.
Now, we can do that as individuals, especially when we ourselves are in positions of power and influence. Though, as we've seen, this does put us at risk of becoming either overwhelmed or disheartened. So in this sense, it might be better to try and do it as a community. And this, I think, is where revolution stories do teach us something valuable. For at their core, what they tell us is that even though we have no power as individuals, we do have power when we are united.
People should not be afraid of their governments. Governments should be afraid of their people.
Our time is one of many widespread and structural problems. We are facing the challenges of having to change our relation to our environment, of having to fix the ethical consequences of a global treadmill of production, and maybe even having to rethink our economic system in its entirety. We are increasingly facing the implications of a culture of selfishness, of polarization, of a culture that wants us to consume or be unhappy, that blames us for its faults, and then demands us to keep consuming but also to do it responsibly, sustainably, mindfully, or again, be unhappy. And yet, despite these many issues, our time is also one with unprecedented potential for mobilization, for finding allies, for establishing power through togetherness. This, of course, is easier said than done, and the reality of it is probably far less exciting and far more complicated than the promise. Perhaps all of this is too radical of an ideal, but then again, as Hannah Arendt wrote, good can be radical, and so maybe it is time for us to start thinking more radically. Speaking of radical action, for a while now I've been working together with dozens of amazing creators like PhilosophyTube, Lindsay Ellis, H-Bomberguy, Lessons from the Screenplay, and many more, to build a new streaming service called Nebula. Partnered with CuriosityStream, Nebula is offering a new home to your favorite creators, a place where we are free to be creative, where we receive fair compensation, and where we can rely on the support of a strong community. For you, it is a place where you can watch our videos without any ads or sponsors, and enjoy some exclusive content. For example, on Nebula, you can watch an extended version of my video on sacred spaces in Skyrim, and you can see my series of shorts on Stoic philosophy in their full glory as one extended video. Again, all this and more can be found on Nebula. And the best part is, you can get Nebula for free by signing up for CuriosityStream. CuriosityStream is a streaming service with thousands of documentaries and non-fiction titles, like the film Bag It, which gives a solid introductory overview of the problem of plastic and the parties that are involved in it. Whereas CuriosityStream is all about big-budget, non-fiction productions like these, they also love independent creators, which is why they are helping us to grow our platform. And which is why I'm excited to share that, for this Memorial Day weekend only, you can now get a 41% discount on their annual plan. That is less than $12 for a whole year of both CuriosityStream and Nebula. So if you'd rather be watching extra content instead of this ad, enjoy some fantastic documentaries, and help out my channel and that of many of the other creators you know and love, be sure to head on over to curiositystream.com/likestoriesofold to get the best deal in streaming today.